Welcome to Beyond the Music, the podcast where we dive into the lives and stories of people who shaped the world of music. I am Lena.
And I am Karina. We're both classically trained singers, and this podcast is our chance to explore the fascinating intersections of music, history, and humanity.
In our last episode, we talked about the friendship of the two composers, Gustav Holst and Ralph Vaughan Williams. And today, I'm taking the reins to guide you into something I kind of mentioned before in episode 2.
Am I able to put my feet up, or...?
Maybe. In episode 2, I talked about Dmitri Shostakovich and specifically about composers in difficult regimes. And in this episode, it's kind of close to my heart because it's based on the topic of my bachelor thesis, titled Lady Macbeth des Mtsensker Landkreises von Dmitri Shostakovich, ein Spiegelbild der Frau in der russischen Gesellschaft des 19. Jahrhunderts, which translates...
Yes, please! Because I understood the Lady Macbeth.
Yeah, which translates to Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk District by Dmitri Shostakovich, a mirror image of women in the 19th century Russian society.
Ooh.
So it's, I talk a little bit of that and about the opera and everything. So basically, I just tell you what I wrote in my bachelor thesis, because I was thinking about it in the episode 2, that I could talk about that. And then I was like, why not?
Well, that's what's fascinating about this podcast. We can really talk about anything.
Yeah, exactly. So... this work not only showcases Shostakovich's revolutionary voice, but also opens up profound questions about the role of women in music, in society, and in history. So, my feminism side comes out. It's about it's about what happens when a composer dares to give a voice to a silenced woman in a world that wants her invisible. But before we dive into the deeper meanings, let's just briefly walk through the plot of the opera and introduce its key characters. The story of Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk District follows Katarina Izmailova, a merchant's wife trapped in a dull, oppressive marriage to the impotent and absent Zinovy. Her father-in-law, Boris, is overbearing and cruel, constantly reminding her of her failures and humiliating her. When Zinovy, her husband, leaves on a business trip, Katerina falls for Sergei, a charming but manipulative worker on their estate. Their affair quickly becomes physical, and when Boris, her father-in-law, discovers it, Katarina and Sergei murder him by poisoning his food. Later, they kill Zinovy, her husband, as well, hiding his body in the cellar. Eventually, the crimes are discovered, and both Katarina and Sergei are sent to Siberia as prisoners. In the final act, Sergei betrays Katarina with another female prisoner, Sonyetka. In a moment of despair, rage, and heartbreak, Katarina pushes Sonyetka into an icy river and jumps in after her, ending her own life. So the major figures in the opera are Katarina herself, Zinovy, her husband, Boris, her father-in-law, and Sergei, her lover, and also kind of Sonyetka, the prisoner, who becomes her final rival. The opera is brutal, psychological, and relentless in its portrayal of violence, desire, and power. Now, something important about the title. Why is it called Lady Macbeth? Shostakovich chose this name deliberately, even though it's not a direct adaptation of Shakespeare's play. The reference is symbolic. Like Shakespeare's Lady Macbeth, Katharina is a woman who takes matters in her own hands, commits murder, and ultimately faces psychological unraveling. But unlike Shakespeare's character, who is often portrayed as manipulative from the outset, Katharina's actions stem more from desperation and oppression than ambition. So the title was meant to resonate with audiences familiar with Shakespeare's infamous anti-heroine, but it also offers a stark contrast. Here we see a working-class woman, not a noble, whose tragedy is shaped as much as society's cruelty as by her own moral choices. So now that we have the narrative context, let's talk about the world in which the story unfolds.
Oh my, that is such a twisted
storyline. Let's begin by setting the stage. 19th century
Literally.
Russia, exactly, literally, 19th century Russia and the Soviet Union of the 1930s. Shostakovich's opera, which premiered in 1934, is based on the 1865 novella by Nikolai Leskov. The story centers on Katerina Ismailova, a merchant's wife trapped in a suffocating marriage. She's childless, ignored by her husband, abused by her father-in-law, and slowly consumed by the desire for something. Anything that feels like freedom. What Shostakovich did with this material was revolutionary. Instead of portraying Katerina as a villainess, as Leskov originally did with some irony in his novel, he reframed her as a tragic, complex, and sympathetic figure. He called her a smart, talented, beautiful woman whose descent into murder was provoked by the world around her. So here's a question for you, Karina.
Okay, I am ready.
When you think about female characters in opera, how often do you think they are allowed this kind of emotional complexity?
Well, anything previous to this opera, very little. Very little. I mean, however, during this time, we also had characters such as Salome, which was incredible. But before this, not as in depth.
Exactly. Also, they are also always kind of more or less displayed as the crazy ones.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're just like, it's not something like this. That's why this opera stands out. It's like intended to be the first part of a tetralogy about women across Russian history. So,
wow.
Can you believe the second part was going to be about a female anarchist who tried to assassinate the Tsar? That would have been incredible, I think, but sadly never came to that.
Well, how come he didn't compose it?
Wow. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. I come to that later. Back to Katerina.
Really holding the reins today.
Yeah, back to Katerina. Her first aria is already a protest. She's bored, lonely, and suffocating. She sings of the stillness in her life and how everything around her is dull and lifeless. She craves movement, love, and purpose. But since she's also childless, she has no other purpose kind of in life, because that's something in the time where would have given her something, you know.
Mm-hmm.
She isn't a femme fatale. Like, this is a woman drowning in silence. When the opera premiered in 1934, it was a sensation. Bold, gritty, intense. The audiences responded to its rawness, but just 2 years later, everything changed. The infamous Pravda article, which I also mentioned in episode 2, likely commissioned or approved by Stalin, labeled the opera as muddle instead of music.
Oh.
That phrase became synonymous with Soviet disapproval. Why is that? It is because it was everything Soviet art was not supposed to be. It was chaotic, violent, and centered on a woman who defied authority.
And we can't have that.
You can't have that. The music itself was modernist and disturbing, full of dissonance, grotesque instrumentation, and cutting satire. So, if you want to know more about the specific topic, listen back to episode 2, because there it's going a little bit more about what Soviet art should be and should not be. Yeah. And there's a brutal scene in the opera where workers attack a cook named Aksinya. Shostakovich doesn't shy away from its violence. Katarina steps in, not just as a bystander, but as a defender of another woman. And this is a turning point. It's her first act of rebellion, which is not murder. Because Aksinya at that moment, she's raped. So they are trying to rape her. And she's stepping in and saying the men they should go away. So Karina, when you hear about a scene like that, Katarina stepping in to stop a violent act, do you see it as the beginning of her downfall or the first spark of her liberation?
I would have to say the first spark of liberation, because she's actually doing something that she's always wanted to do, but she has been silenced up until now.
Yeah, that's kind of the question the opera focuses on. It doesn't moralize, it just shows. It does not give it a kind of a rating if it's good or bad, you know? Let's talk about the music. Because in Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk District, the orchestra doesn't just accompany the story, it actively tells it. Shostakovich uses recurring musical motifs to build a psychological portrait of Katerina and the world around her. So, in my thesis, I focused on 3 specific motifs that appear throughout the opera. There are also a little bit more like smaller ones, but these are like more or less the main 3 motifs which you can kind of extract from the music. The first motif is widely recognized in the literature as the violence motif. I'll call it motive A. It appears throughout Shostakovich's entire body of work and is rhythmic rather than melodic. Its most violent form includes accented repeated notes, which are strikingly audible in the police music during scenes 7 and 8. It doesn't represent a person, but an oppressive force. Systemic, brutal, and inescapable. It embodies both physical and psychological violence.
Wow.
The second motive, motive B, is a tone sequence associated with multiple characters, especially Katerina, her father-in-law Boris, and the prisoners. In the first scene, this motive evolves step by step. It first accompanies Katarina's opening lines, then transforms into Boris's main theme. This shows his looming influence over her from the beginning. There are 2 versions of this motive, one which is repetitive notes linked more to Boris, and a smoother version that relates to Katarina. It's also tied to the theme of sleeplessness. It recurs in scenes where Katarina lies awake, where Boris roams restlessly at night, and the final scene where the exhausted prisoners long for rest. And then there's motive C. A descending 3-note figure that recurs throughout the opera, always in connection with the useless men. So it's the kind of useless men theme.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have reacted that way. I'm sorry. I apologize to all of our men.
Yeah. It's not for all the men in the opera, but for the specific kind. Aside from the old prisoner at the end, every male character is portrayed as ineffectual or destructive. So there's one where the theme is not appearing.
Okay.
This motive comments particularly on male sexual inadequacy. Katerina's impotent husband, for example, and Boris, who reminisces about his lost vitality, kind of. Like, he's also trying to get with Katerina when his son is away. Because he's saying, like, his son couldn't make you a child, so let's try. I already, like... Yeah,
that's terrible.
Yeah. So this movement also appears in two forms. The dactylic version symbolizes impotence, most clearly tied to Zinovy, and the anapestic version stands for potency.
Wow.
Usually associated with Boris and sometimes Sergei, so her new love interest. It's musical irony at its best. As the opera progresses, these motives intertwine and evolve. Shostakovich doesn't let any single idea remain pure. Passion is contaminated by violence. Repression bleeds into identity, and even the motives themselves begin to blur. This layering is what makes the opera musically and emotionally so profound. So, Karina, when you think about how motives like these can reflect internal states and external forces all at once, what does that make you feel as a performer or as a listener?
It almost makes me feel uneasy in a way. What about you? How does it make you feel?
I mean, since the orchestra is also kind of like a narrator, it's not just the persons who are singing, it's like the background music, like it's giving, it's always like an extra feeling to it. And of course, it's never a positive one in that opera.
Well, and that's just it. It's not positive, and because it is giving so much, it's almost overwhelming, making it so uncomfortable.
Yeah, exactly.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. So as a performer, you have it probably way easier to get into the role. But as a listener, you will be sitting on needles the whole time.
Yes, and that's what makes it so uncomfortable. Yeah. Which is great for the story.
Yeah, so it doesn't just accompany the drama, it tells the psychological truth of it. Like it's putting more depth into it. So, after the opera was banned in 1936, Shostakovich was terrified. He withdrew his Fourth Symphony and shifted to more conservative work. Only decades later, in 1963, did he dare to return Lady Macbeth, now revised under the safer title Katarina Izmailova.
Oh.
So this version cut out the most graphic scenes and toned down the harshest music. And yes, it was performed again, but many felt it had lost its edge. Some argue that Shostakovich had to sell part of his soul to make it acceptable. And others believe he used to refine his ideas. Well, Karina, I'm curious, do you think it's even possible for an artist to revise something so raw without losing its essence?
Oh, that I really don't know. I really don't know how to answer that. I mean, yeah, I don't know if it's possible or not. It's a very deep question.
It's also under the you have to think about art under censorship. Was it something he wanted to do? Was it something he felt he had to do that his art can still be played? So he gave in, kind of, and lost kind of what he wanted to say with the opera. Did he sell his soul? Like you of course cannot know that because he was under pressure. He was so he was of course cautious, but yeah.
Wow.
Well, now zooming out, let's look at the historical context in more depth. In 19th century Russia, women occupied one of the lowest rungs of the social hierarchy. They were often treated as property, first belonging to their fathers and then transferred to their husbands through arranged marriages. Women had no legal standing to act independently. They couldn't sign contracts, own property, or initiate divorce without great difficulty. In fact, Russian civil law until the mid-19th century designated women as legal minors, effectively equating them with children in terms of their rights. They were bound to the patriarchal family model, enshrined in both the civil code and religious doctrine. The Russian Orthodox Church emphasized female submission and glorified the virtues of silence, humility, and endurance. Even culturally, the proverbs and sayings of the time were loaded with misogyny. One of the most chilling is, "A chicken is no bird, and a woman is no person."
I don't like that.
Yeah, implying that women were so beneath consideration they didn't even count as part of the human world. And this context absolutely permeates Shostakovich's opera. Katerina is hemmed in by more than just a loveless marriage. She's suffocating in a structure designed to erase her voice, her agency, and even her desires. Her father-in-law constantly polices her body and mind, reminding her of her reproductive failures and treating her as a housekeeper rather than a human being. What's radical is how Shostakovich doesn't frame her rebellion as a flaw, but as a reaction. He allows Katerina emotional depth and more ambiguity, something women characters were rarely granted, especially in opera. Her affair, her violence, her final act, they are always expressions of someone who's clawing towards autonomy in a society that denies her that right. In this sense, she becomes a symbol not only of Russian women of the past, but also of women trapped in patriarchal systems everywhere. Her transgressions are her form of resistance. And by giving her the music that is rich, romantic, and emotionally expressive, Shostakovich lifts her above the grotesque worlds she inhabits, at least for a while. So I wonder, Karina, how do you think this portrayal of a repressed woman in the 19th century Russia resonates with modern audiences today?
It's a very good question. I think a lot of us are still up against the patriarchy. So I do think that the opera is still very prevalent today and relevant.
I actually think it's getting more relevant again. If you see how some rulers of countries are turning everything that women fought for back to a few hundred years back, especially about reproductive rights and everything.
Well, it kind of goes back to the saying, is art imitating life or is life imitating art? Which comes first?
Yeah.
And how art in any form, music, sculpture, paintings, is still very important today because it acts as a mirror to ourselves.
Well, but like that's the world Katerina lived in the opera. Her only power came through transregression. And yet, in giving her voice, Shostakovich also gave her humanity. He wasn't just writing about Katerina, he was writing about all the women erased by history. So, having heard all this, who do you think Katerina really is? Is she a criminal, a victim, a symbol?
I think that she is a representation of her time. Whether it is an accurate, as in a factual, especially to the extent that she went to, I don't think we'll ever know.
Yeah. Yeah. It's what makes the opera kind of haunting because it leaves us in the gray. Shostakovich didn't want to condemn or glorify. He wanted us to see and listen. And at the end, it's like he gives it back to the listener to decide what to think of it. I mean, you have at the end, you have the Katerina who is throwing like the woman who slept with her love interest in the river, and she jumps after it, and then you just see how the chorus of the prisoners is walking away, and that's the end.
Wow. So
there's no comment on it, just happened and no one was impressed by it. Yeah. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. It was a like darker topic, but I really like that opera. And if you liked this episode, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review.
Next time, we'll delve into another fascinating chapter of music history. Until then, keep listening and discovering the stories beyond the music. See you next time.